Hello, I think it's time for another episode of Stan the History Man. And today I want to talk about, I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, retired college university professor in US and Canada. Today I'd like to talk about the Army's concrete battleship. Now, well, you may ask, how could that be? A battleship made out of concrete. Well, what it was a fortification built in Manila Harbor early in the 20th century. I'll show you a model of it, which I made out of plaster of Paris. So not exactly concrete, but it gives you an idea of the real thing. And I'll talk more about it as we go along. It was built to have four 14-inch cannon built into turrets. That would be about the largest size of battleship guns in those days, American battleships anyway, 14 inches, and rotating armored turrets, and then two side things of 7-inch guns. The little you can see on the hull here. It was made out of concrete. It was an island in Manila Bay. It was designed to defend Manila Bay, and this island was leveled right down the waterline. And then this concrete coast defense fortification was literally poured on this island. And it was shaped like a battleship, not to be coy or anything, but because the water the tide through the bay, they felt it would like less impact on the concrete, wouldn't wear it away so much. It was shaped and pointed like a battleship. And supposedly more than one Coast Guard officer was nonplussed to report, oh, the battleship is coming in, but it's not burning any fuel with all coal burners. And so you'd see it. And it doesn't seem to be moving either. Well, that was the Army's concrete battleship. It was completed about 1910, and the test guns were fired. And then it sat there, part of the, I think, misbegotten strategy of defending the Philippines. It was too close to Japan to not worry the Japanese at this big base here, too far from America to resupply it. And once after Pearl Harbor, we lost most of our Pacific fleet, at least temporarily, the Philippines were cut off and trapped. And the loss of the Philippines is the biggest disaster in U.S. military history. However, the Army's concrete battleship did its best during the Japanese siege of the Philippines. The Army retreated to the Bataan Peninsula south of Manila. MacArthur still believed that it's a crazy idea he could defend the Philippines. We just didn't have the equipment, we didn't have the manpower, but he thought that we could with the Army, and also the B-20. He thought the B-17 bombers could blast the Japanese all over the place, and that didn't work either. So it was the worst military disaster in our history. But Fort Drum blasted away, and the other fortifications in Manila Bay were badly handled or smashed up and so on, not completely, but very badly so. But Drum, with its thick concrete walls, I mean, several feet thick in the most important parts, like ammunition storage and that type of thing, never lost a man. In fact, I think a couple were injured, but not that seriously. In fact, I was reading about one officer. They said, well, you can take a rest and get away from the bombardment of Bataan and take a small boat over to Fort Drum. And he said it was one. He just sat there and he felt the place shaking, but nothing ever happened. So it's almost like a rest camp. Although, of course, Fort Drum fought back. And another thing I should point out, that there's no question that Fort Drum's guns could fire in all directions. And this is one of the criticisms of Singapore, which isn't quite true, but that the British giant guns at Singapore couldn't turn around completely. Well, 3 of the 5 guns they had could turn around, but I don't think they did much good to it. Although you could say one thing, they kept the Japanese from invading Malaya, what was called Malaya, then not Malaysia, from the sea. But the same thing as Fort Drum did, they kept the Japanese Navy out of Manila Bay. And so it held on until, and the Japanese pounded it. And this is what I've made out of plaster, not concrete, was the way it looked on the final day it fought, when it surrendered. But it was never captured by the Japanese. When all the Philippines under General Wainwright had to surrender, well, that would include the Fort Drum. But quite a few of the officers and men said, why should we surrender? They haven't been able to breach our defenses. We're giving them a hard time. See, one of the one of the problems with the Singapore guns was they were loaded with anti it's armor plate piercing ammunition to break through battleship armor, and but they had to turn it if they could turn them around to hit the Japanese. They said, well, that wasn't very effective. Just be buried in the mud. Well, the Fort Drum was very effective. They apparently broke up regimental-sized Japanese attacks on Bataan. So I'm not quite sure, and I'll talk about this sometime more detail about Singapore, which was the British greatest defeat in their at least their modern history, just as the Philippines was our greatest defeat. But at least we went down fighting there at not just Fort Drum. I mean, the troops at Bataan and so on, the battling bastards of Bataan, no papa, no mama, no Uncle Sam, and nobody gives a damn. But at least they went down fighting. Um, they the heat was terrific, even though it was December. And there's, of course, no air conditioning. They had these great fans, but the first Japanese bombardment knocked those giant fans out. And so there was a shortage of water. But as one of the uh, survivors of this report, these men were soldiers. They were, they're used to cutting down on the water and just keep and doing their duty. Constant bombardment from very heavy Japanese forces, which just blasted a lot of the chipped on a lot of the concrete off the but never penetrated the armored turrets here, which fired right back at the Japanese, and as I say, it broke up like division-sized attacks. And so finally, Fort Drum had to they had a medal, a tin flag. They painted themselves flying, and the flag was still there right to the end. And when it was blasted down, they put it up again or put up a new one. But in the end, they threw it in Manila Bay. I guess it's still there, and had to surrender the fort, as with all the Corregidor defenses. See, Bataan surrendered in April of 42, and then Corregidor, that is the forts, including Drum, surrendered in May of 1942. And all the people, I'll tell you this, every American soldier in the Philippines either died or was captured. Some actually got into the jungles and tried to, and sometimes very successfully, got Filipino resistance to the Japanese, but they didn't get out. Just MacArthur and his staff got out. It was a trap, it was a giant trap. And looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, well, we never should have had more than a corporal's guard there to say, well, this is the Philippines, and it's being protected by the United States, but not to put in all this equipment and troops and that sort of thing, because it was indefensible. Too close to Japan, too far away from America. So they surrendered in May. Don't know exact date because it was like incremental. In May of 42, and then they went into the hell of being Japanese prisoners of war. But as I say, they fought to the end and fought well. Now, see, Fort Drum is almost indestructible. It's concrete, and it's but one of the things that and so also when we returned to the Philippines, the Japanese got into Fort Drum, but they couldn't use the guns. I think they would pretty well effectively disarmed them. They took the breech locks out and threw them in the Manila Bay. And I guess the Japanese never found them there, or the salt water affected them. I don't know what, but they still were there in Fort Drum. And so we called on them to surrender. And they actually, one of the guys was calling him, and he was shot dead. So I said, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy, and pumped all kinds of kerosene and gasoline water into Fort Drum and blew it up. And it made an enormous mushroom cloud, almost like a forerunner of Hiroshima. And every single Japanese soldier there died, just like the exact opposite. No Americans died at Fort Drum. Every single Japanese died at Fort Drum. And so after the war, coast defense wasn't, it was gone. The air power taking care of that. And so it sat there. And the worst thing was not just the passage of time, which couldn't do too much to concrete and steel. But after about 1970, I think the corrupt Marcos government in the Philippines allowed this. They allowed the scrap dealers to go on board and take off a lot of the copper and iron and that type of thing. So you could say the worst damage to Fort Drum was from the Filipino scrap dealers. But it's still there, and you can take a tour of Fort Drum if you're ever in Manila and say, this is the way it looked after it survived all the Japanese bombardment and so on, and never surrendered. The U.S. Army's concrete battleship. Well, thank you for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and tune in again. We'll have some more history talks. Goodbye.